Welcome back to Inner Calling Astrology, where it's never too late to be who you are. This is the third episode of the Sun Sign series, and we're going to look at the third sign, Gemini. Gemini season begins in spring and ends in the summer. So we could say that change is natural for Gemini. While Taurus is a fixed sign, seeking stability and predictability, Gemini is what's known as a mutable sign. It's fluid, active, and restless. Gemini appreciates change, novelty, new horizons, and the unknown comprise Gemini's daily bread. While a Taurus native would likely be content sitting in the garden and taking in the sights, scents, and sounds, Gemini would be more likely to be looking up the genus and species of the various flowers. And if you visit a Gemini in their garden, don't be surprised if you're treated to a tutorial on plant classifications, flowering versus non-flowering, perennial versus annuals. Oh, and what about those fascinating blossoms that appear to be hybrids? The snapdragon, which is considered an annual, but can act like a perennial under certain conditions. Gemini is in a continual dialogue with the universe. Gemini is known as the twins. Why are twins the symbol for Gemini? There are a few plausible explanations, but I'm going to put forth the idea that it generally takes at least two people to hold a conversation. So my take is that the twins symbolize Gemini's perennial need for endless discussion. And I think it's quite meaningful that they're not identical twins. According to Roman mythology, these twins, Castor and Pollux, were born of different fathers, affording them quite different perspectives. In fact, one was immortal and the other human, so they would likely see the world very differently. And isn't that necessary if we're going to have an interesting conversation? If we're going to find out more about the universe than we already know? Certainly for a Gemini. It's imperative, vital. Gemini is known for its open-minded, childlike curiosity. To a Gemini, the universe is basically just a huge basket or treasure trove of unanswered questions. The goal of Gemini is awe. To maintain a state of open-minded wonder about the world around them. Not surprisingly, Gemini is what's known as an air sign. Air signs are associated with the intellect and with the ability to pay attention to our environment. And as I've mentioned, Gemini is known for its mentally inquisitive nature, its ability to take notice of the surrounding world. And if you think about it, the element of air actually does play a vital role in our ability to perceive and connect with the world. Air fills the space between ourselves and everyone else above sea level. When we open our mouths to speak, it's air that carries the message to someone else's ear. And we've all heard of using smoke signals to transmit messages. And how about carrier pigeons? And if we smell smoke, well, that alerts us to some important information as well. And as someone breezes by us, we feel the air brush against us, and we're informed of their proximity. Now let's look at the planetary ruler of Gemini, Mercury. The planetary ruler of Gemini is Mercury, and Mercury is known as the message bearer. Mercury represents our mental faculties. It's about thought, language, communication, speaking, listening. And all of these processes begin with perception. Perception precedes thought, and thought precedes speech. Well, in most cases. And the most fundamental question we can ask ourselves as we pay attention to our environment, to the sensory input, is can we see what is before us without imposing our personal or cultural dogma? Can we see something for what it is rather than prematurely relegating it to a familiar category? Must we consign everything to the familiar, thus robbing what we see of truth, wonder, magic, and surprise? I want to give a shout out here to my teacher, Stephen Forrest, for addressing this issue in his book titled Air, which covers the 3 air signs, Gemini, Libra, and Aquarius. How and to what do you pay attention? So let's talk a bit more about how we tend to forget to notice who or what is in front of us. Think about how you perceive an old friend in the course of a conversation. Do you assume you already fully know them? Do you listen closely to what they say as you did when you were first getting to know them? And another relevant question to ask ourselves is, to what do we pay attention? And we can find important clues by looking at what sign and what house we find Mercury in our chart. Now, for curiosity's sake, I chose a famous chef to investigate where we would find Mercury. Here is the example of celebrity chef Gordon Ramsay's chart. And not surprisingly, we find his Mercury in the 6th house of health. Gemini is his rising sign. The rising sign represents the style in which he interacts with the world. For any of you who are not familiar with his show, he travels around the country helping restaurant owners improve their businesses by observing the owner and kitchen staff in action, asking them hard questions, and then teaching them a winning strategy. We can see the imprint of Ramsay's Geminian social persona, highly verbal, inquisitive, travel-oriented, and fast-paced. And speaking of the concept of speed, another relevant fact about Mercury is that it's the fastest planet. Mercury speeds along at 107,000 miles an hour and completes an orbit around the sun in 88 days. Mercury is associated with speed, youth, activity, travel, and Mercury people share these attributes, tending to be youthful, energetic, busy, restless, and active well into their later years. Now let's consider from a past life perspective why someone might choose to be a Gemini this life. What prior life circumstances might make being a Gemini this life the optimal choice? Let's pretend you grew up on a farm bordering a small town and spent most of your time with the people in close proximity, your family, maybe longtime classmates. And let's say there's one schoolhouse with one teacher. Year after year, you see the same classmates and teacher, and everyone reads the few published works sitting on the one small bookshelf. Now let's imagine what the main street of the town might look like. Maybe it stretches a block or two. And perhaps on that main street, there are a handful of businesses, a few tradespeople, a doctor, and of course, there's a church. the only church for miles. Everyone in town and surrounding areas attend this one church. Everyone is taught the same beliefs about God, morality, life, death. It's a simple, comforting existence. Everyone knows the important truths. No guesswork needed. Little Jane asks, "Where do we go when we die?" And her parents quote the local preacher, "To heaven if you've been a good girl, and to hell if you've broken the rules." Lots of black and white rules in this part of the world. Not a lot of room for questions, discussion, different perspectives, or dissenting opinion. Now let's say one day you're invited to visit family in a nearby big city. At first, you're a little fretful. This town is the only place you've ever known, and you've heard some scary things about big cities. But you hop on the train, and you actually start to enjoy watching the scenery dance by. Your apprehension starts to turn into excited anticipation. You get off the train at Grand Central Station, and you're in awe of how huge this station is. You've never seen so many people. As you move along towards the entrance to the subway system, you hear people speaking in all different languages and dialects, and you're fascinated. You pass a host of different musicians as you head to the subway platform. You tap your feet as you think about how different all the rhythms are from your own church choir. You finally get out into the street, and it looks like the 4th of July with all the lights. So many stores, crowds, traffic, food vendors line the sidewalk. You ask your mom if you can try one of everything from the different food vendors. Then you visit a huge building with no furniture, just paintings on the walls. You're told it's a museum. You look at all the paintings, the sculptures, the architecture, and so many thoughts and feelings arise in you. Your next stop is the city's main library. You're astounded by the enormous amount of books. The shelves are as long as your hometown's main street. You look at the unfamiliar titles, and you notice there are books on every subject. There are even books on different religions. Wow, you didn't even know there were any other religions. And you wonder how they differ from your own. And then you ask yourself, how could there possibly be any other religion since yours is the true religion and there's only one God? You don't mention this to your mom, but you wonder. And then, before you head back to your hometown, your mom takes you to a show. It was a Harry Potter play. You were riveted as you watched the characters reenact the same magic tricks you've seen in the movies. How did they do that? That night, you can hardly sleep after all the excitement. You're looking forward to telling your friends and family about this adventure when you arrive home the next day. As you head back home the following morning, you're still filled with a sense of wonder as you recall everything you've witnessed. So much to think about and process, so many questions, and so many good stories to tell everyone in your hometown. And just as you're thinking about how little you knew about God's green earth, and that there exists so much more than you could have imagined, you look up and, clear as day, the word God in the sky. And you're feeling a strong sense of certainty. Certainty that there is so much you don't know. And on second thought, does that say God or COD? To be a Gemini is to live with that sense of wonder and hunger to know more. Gemini wants to pack 5 lifetimes of learning into a single lifetime. My teacher, Stephen Forrest, always says, if you want to kill a Gemini, bore her to death. Here are 4 Gemini archetypes, which can prove useful in absorbing the essence of the Gemini path: the journalist, the teacher, the witness, and the storyteller. Now, I'm going to introduce you to a historical character whose life epitomizes Gemini values. Pioneering investigative journalist Elizabeth Cochrane Seaman, better known as Nelly Bly. Despite being only 21 and a woman at a time in history, the mid-1800s, when women were almost exclusively relegated to writing about society, gardening, or fashion, Nelly Bly was given the latitude to do what Gemini does best: ask the probing questions. She questioned cultural assumptions about a woman's role in society. In her first article for the Pittsburgh Dispatch, a Pennsylvania newspaper, she wrote an article titled "The Girl Puzzle," in which Bly asked such questions as, why shouldn't women be given more career opportunities? And why do we assume that every woman's destiny must include marriage? Naturally, there were many that resented her challenging the status quo. For instance, when Nelly Bly investigated the conditions of women factory workers, the owners of these manufacturing plants complained to the editor of the newspaper, resulting in Nelly being reassigned to the fashion page. Having no interest in writing about fashion, society, or gardening, Bly chose instead to spend 6 months in Mexico as a foreign correspondent, reporting on the corruption of the Mexican government. Bly's Geminian habit of reporting simply what she observed once again attracted disapproval, and she found herself having to flee the country to avoid imprisonment. Undaunted by her narrow escape from Mexican authorities and the directive from her editor to write about more conventionally gender-appropriate subjects, she quit the Pittsburgh newspaper and relocated to New York, where she got a job with another paper, the New York World, owned by Joseph Pulitzer. Early in her tenure at the New York City newspaper, Bly wrote a series of articles about the Blackwell Island Mental Asylum, which was later compiled into a book titled 10 Days in a Madhouse. Nelly Bly pioneered undercover investigative reporting by feigning insanity in order to witness conditions as an insider. During her 10 days in the New York City asylum, Bly recorded the conditions of her confinement and penned a scathing expose of the severe mistreatment and misdiagnosis of women who were often involuntarily committed to the institution. Her Geminian inquiry and reporting led to a greatly improved level of care in these institutions and shone a light on the need for the staff to act in a more humane manner. Bly's undercover investigative style raised the journalistic bar. She garnered acclaim and celebrity for her efforts. It wasn't long before she set out on yet another journalistic adventure, one that allowed her to fulfill a Geminian dream, allowed her curious mind to explore the mysteries and magic of the entire world. In 1889, Nelly Bly set out to circumnavigate the globe. She began the expedition on the German ocean liner, the SS Augusta Victoria. She also traveled by train, rickshaw, horse, and donkey, and completed the expedition in just 72 days. Now, Gemini, as I mentioned, is associated with speed, so Bly, having circled the world so quickly, and by the way, in the context of a race against a competing female journalist, is quite synchronistic with the spirit of Gemini. The public was riveted by the story of her departure and her continued adventures. Bly garnered international attention and acclaim with her exploits. Journalists covered each day of her trip. Finally, as the world watched, on February 8, 1890, Bly completed her journey, disembarking from the train in Jersey City. Bly received a hero's welcome, with the public hungry to hear every detail of the journey. Bly's personal account of the trip was eventually published as a book. During her record-breaking trip around the globe, Bly had continually journaled her observations, the events, and the shifting landscape. Now, Gemini, as I mentioned, is said to attempt to pack several lifetimes into one. And Nelly Bly certainly exemplified this thirst for fresh perceptions. Now I'd like to take a look at Bly's chart. So this may come as a surprise, but Nelly Bly was not, in fact, a Gemini, although she certainly appeared to live her life with Geminian values of unending curiosity, continual questioning of social mores, eloquent communication skills, varied interests, and rapid-fire activity. Bly, curiously, was actually a Taurus. So how can we explain this? Well, let's begin simply by looking at the placement of Mercury in her chart. As I mentioned earlier, Mercury is the planet of perception, thought, and communication. And it's what's called the ruling planet of Gemini. Any planet that is in the sign it rules is especially prominent in the person's makeup and is known as being in a position of exaltation. So with Bly's Mercury in the sign of Gemini, the planet was on steroids. But that alone doesn't fully explain Bly's extraordinary life. And I didn't intend to go off topic, but now I'm tempted in the spirit of Gemini, with its rambling stream of consciousness style, to delve further into Bly's chart and her past life signature. So I'm going to briefly look at what's called the South Node, the marker for the prior life. The South Node is the symbol for who Nelly Bly was in the past life history. We see that it's only 3 degrees away from the sun. So we can say that the South Node, the past life indicator, is conjunct the sun. This means that she would have had a solar-type personality in the past life. She would have shone brightly. People would have revolved around her in the same way the planets revolve around the sun. The sun symbolizes someone with great power, presence, and influence. This could explain Nelly Bly's presumption of power this life. How else would a young woman in the 1800s dare to trust her perceptions and presume she had the right to boldly speak up, let alone about controversial subjects? So for now, I'm going to resist any more analysis of Bly's chart and just take a moment to marvel at her remarkable life's journey, animated by endless questions and observations. Let's review Gemini. The element is air, and that relates to the intellect and paying attention. The mode is mutable, meaning that there is a fluidity and appreciation for change. The ruler is Mercury, which is related to raw perceptions, thought, communication, and travel. A good way of remembering the essence of a sign is to think of the archetypes. The Gemini archetypes are the journalist, the teacher, the witness, and the storyteller. The goal of Gemini is awe. Wherever we find Gemini, we need to pay attention. So the majority of us do not have our sun in Gemini, but all of us are likely to have either a planet or a house cusp in the sign of Gemini. And that's an area of life in which we need to pay attention. An area in which we should allow ourselves to see things with new eyes, to look at something as if it's the first time we're viewing it, and to assume that when we ask a question, the universe will answer. Now, Jupiter is currently in the sign of Gemini. It transited into the sign of Gemini on May 25th, 2024, and will remain there until June 9th, 2025. Jupiter is the planet of luck, opportunity, and expansion. Now, whenever Jupiter enters a house, we ask ourselves, how have we been underestimating ourselves in this area? And then we set our expectations higher. So during Jupiter's transit through Gemini, let's ask ourselves the questions that we hadn't dreamed of asking. Like Nelly Bly in the 1800s asking, why shouldn't women be given more career opportunities? What questions have you not yet dreamed of asking? I look forward to seeing you next month when we discuss the sign of Cancer. And remember, it's never too late to be who you are.